Welcome. Our reading today is David Hume, The Irrelevance of Consent. Hume, like so many of the other thinkers we've been reading to this point, Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, so he's he's not a he's a critic of social contract theory, but he shares many of the assumptions, and he shares the general framework in a lot of ways, right? And so he opens. I guess I wanted to draw attention to a point of connection here between Hume and the other thinkers before we see what they disagree about. And so here he opens with a thought that should be familiar to us by now. Let's just read this. This is on page 66 at the very beginning of The Irrelevance of Consent. Quote, "When we consider how nearly equal all men are in their bodily force and even in their mental powers and faculties, till cultivated by education, which of course requires something like a civil society, an established state, all the rest of this, we must necessarily allow that nothing but their own consent could at first associate them together and subject them to any authority." So to this point, right, he's very much in line with our other thinkers. Human beings in a state of nature are physically and mentally roughly equal, and in such a state of nature with rough equality, it would seem that nothing but consent could first lead to any sort of legitimate authority. So he's going to go on, right? It's going to seem like he's in agreement with our other thinkers, and he's not against the social contract. It doesn't seem to at first, at least. The people, he says, if we trace government to its first origin in the woods and deserts, are the source of all power and jurisdiction. People, and voluntarily, for the sake of peace and order, abandon their native liberty, natural liberty, and receive laws from their equal and companion. So the lawgiver was one of them. Maybe they had a turn being the lawgiver, etc. The conditions upon which they were willing to submit were either expressed or were so clear and obvious that it might well be esteemed superfluous to express them. So either you had express and explicit consent, or you had tacit consent, and it was so obvious that there was consent involved that it did not even need to be expressly signified. If this then, he says, be meant by the original contract, or what we're calling social contract theory here, it cannot be denied that all government is, at first, founded on a contract, and that the most ancient, rude combinations of mankind were chiefly formed by that principle. So he's saying this is the way that you would have something like humans in a state of nature transition to legitimate government. However, let's go down further onto the page. He says, further down on page 66, towards the bottom, he says, yet even this consent was very long imperfect. And I think that's an important criticism that he's lodging here. Even if we take it to be tacit consent, and we take it to be consent, whether tacit or explicit, what he's saying is either way, we can still find problems with this consent, whether it's express and explicitly stated by someone, or whether it's tacit and is inferred by signs, as Hobbes would put it. In either case, Hume wants to say consent was very long and imperfect. And here's why, okay? As he puts it on the bottom of 66, almost all governments which exist at present, or of which there remains any record in history, have been founded originally either on usurpation or conquest, or both, without any pretense of a fair consent or voluntary subjection of the people. So, one thing he's pointing out is, when you actually examine any existing government, what you find when you look at the historical record is evidence that in the past there was an act of usurpation, which is the illegitimate obtainment of office, right? Illegitimate, right? A rigged election, for example, or assassination of your opponent. Or if, for instance, right, one thing clearly on Hume and many Scottish, English authors of this time would be something like, in royal families and in situations where you had monarchies, you would frequently have a monarch rise to power by eliminating not merely rivals to this monarch's claim to the throne, but even members of this monarch's own family. Um, right? So perhaps an older brother was in line to inherit the throne, while you poison your older brother, and you have now usurped the throne. Conquest is another thing you find historical testimony for. So in other words, I think what Hume was getting at is when you look at the historical record, what you actually find is most governments have been founded, or many governments have been founded either by usurpation or conquest, not by consent. But he goes on to say, when in our full, you can have usurpation, you can have conquest, and then you could have something like um, what seems to be tacit consent, right? The citizens don't rise up and object to the fact that the legitimate king was poisoned and now the younger brother wants to have the throne, right? You could have people just go along with this, and then it would seem like they're tacitly consenting to it. I think this is what he's starting to get at, right? So, usurpation and conquest, right? By such arts as these, Hume says on the top of 67, many governments have been established, and this is all the original contract which they have to boast of. So, in many cases, he's saying we really don't have something like a real contract being voluntarily agreed to by citizens. Instead, we have force, essentially, whether conquest or usurpation, and then people tacitly condone it and by not resisting it or something like this. So, as he puts it on the top of 67, then, Hume writes, my intention here is not to exclude the consent of the people from being one just foundation of government, where it has place. It is surely the best and most sacred of any. I only pretend, that is, I only claim, I'm only making a claim here, that it has very seldom had place in any degree, and never almost in its full extent. So that's his claim, right? Seldom has it been the case that consent has founded a government. And even where it has been the case, never almost in its full extent. And so therefore he says, some other foundation of government must also be admitted. So what is this other foundation? I think another thing, right, here we go. So let's just get to this point, just below this, towards the top of 67, right? One important piece of support Hume provides for this criticism he's lodging against social contract theory is, right, often this theory, as we've seen with Locke and Hobbes, will claim, right, that every individual has given a tacit consent to the authority of the political ruler, whatever that is, whether it's an assembly or person, and promised him obedience, right? So there's been tacit consent. It may be answered, Hume replies, that such an implied consent can only have place where a man imagines that the matter depends on his choice. And I think what he's getting at here is we can't call something a legitimate case of implied, implicit, tacit consent where there seems to have not really been a choice in the matter. Can I make the choice to say no? And if the answer to that is no, then this is not legitimate tacit consent. So you'll often find, for instance, people making this case say something like, well, a person tacitly consents by remaining within a state and living there and working there. Well, we have to ask ourselves, did this person really have a choice? Did they have the means, the resources, the freedom to leave and go somewhere else more in line with what they believe? Or did they not really have that choice? Was there no place for them to go that was any better? Did they not have the resources that would allow them to move away and settle somewhere else? If not, they really have no choice, and if they really have no choice, if they cannot say no to something, then they cannot legitimately, tacitly consent to it. All right, so when I, agree to have a Facebook profile, I have to, explicitly consent to a number of things, and probably tacitly consent to some other things. But the idea there is like I can say no. I don't have to be on Facebook. I can, make my whole Facebook page go away. Can I? I can at least make it defunct. The idea is something like this. I can say no. I don't have to have a Facebook page or something like this, right? And so that shows you, right, that in some sense, whether explicitly or tacitly, I have consented to it, and if I didn't like it, if I was really opposed to it, I can get off of it, as a number of people have. right? But that's not the case with our government and our laws, and I think is what Hume is pointing out. So let's get to the part where Hume tells us what he thinks another explanation for legitimate government is besides the consent of the governed. At the very bottom of page 68, the very end of this excerpt, Hume writes, "If the reason be asked of that obedience which we are bound to pay to government, I readily answer, because society could not otherwise subsist." And this answer is clear and intelligible to all mankind. Your answer is because we should keep our word. We've made a promise, we've entered into a contract, we've made an agreement. Hume says, no, here's the real reason, right? Because society could not otherwise exist. Okay, that's his explanation, right? Without this government formed and vested with the power it has, power to punish, power to institute laws and enforce and implement them, society would not be able to exist otherwise. And we would all thereby lose the benefits we get from living socially. So that's his answer in a nutshell, is what justifies government and makes it legitimate is that it establishes what he's calling society. It provides security, essentially, for us to do what we need to do, and it provides the framework for us to pursue our interests in a reasonable manner. And the alternative would be something, again, like the state of nature or Hobbesian anarchy. Okay, good enough for today with David Hume and the irrelevance of consent. Take care.